This is the Inspired Pilot Podcast, episode 26.
So looking at all of those things, weighing all those things, if you think you're okay with that and still want to give it a try and still feel passionate about it, then you've got the bug, so to speak, and go for it and don't be talked out of it.
Inspiring stories from inspiring pilots from around the world. Welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast with your host, Marvin Robinson.
Okay, welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast. This is Marvin Robinson, and I'm delighted to introduce today's featured inspiring pilot, Patrick Smith. Welcome to the show, Patrick. Are you ready to inspire today?
I'm ready, Marvin.
Okay, let's go. Patrick Smith is an airline pilot and the host of the popular website askthepilot.com. Patrick is also a published author, and his book, Cockpit Confidential, is a New York Times bestseller. He has also appeared on hundreds of radio and television outlets, and his work is cited on a regular basis in print publications worldwide. He currently works as a first officer on the Boeing 767 and 757, flying both domestic and overseas routes. As well as aviation, Patrick travels extensively in his spare time and so far has visited more than 80 countries. Okay, I've given our listeners, the Inspired Pilots, a short introduction there, Patrick. Can you take a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself and give us a brief overview of what you're doing aviation-wise right now?
Oh, wow. Gee, where to start, Marvin? I've been flying commercially since 1990. I've worked for regional carriers, cargo carriers. Now I'm with a major carrier, and I have my moonlighting job also, where I host and curate my website. I published 2 books. I do occasional commentary on air travel for newspapers, magazines, radio, and so forth. So it all keeps me pretty busy.
Fantastic. Okay, so your professional career started in 1990. It sounds like you've gone along the sort of natural sort of evolution of flying from a professional level. And we'll go into the moonlighting bit in a bit as well, okay? 2 books, but every journey does have to start somewhere. So tell us, Patrick, how did that little seed get sown in the first place?
Honestly, I couldn't tell you because it goes so far back that I just don't remember how and when and for what reasons it got started. When you talk to pilots, airline pilots, you'll often hear them say, well, this all started back in childhood. And that's true for me as well, albeit with a little bit of a twist. And by that, I mean, when I was a kid, when I was in 5th grade, 6th, 7th grade, even before that, I was, I guess, what nowadays they would call an airline geek. I was infatuated with the commercial airline industry. I would go to the airport every week, take anything I could find that had an airline logo on it. I collected timetables and route maps and postcards and plastic wings and so on. And I would stay up at night studying the fold-out route maps from the airline timetables. It wasn't quite so much the thrill of flying in and of itself, much as I came to enjoy that later on. It was kind of more what I like to call the grand theater of air travel, the airplanes, the airports, the places that you flew to, all of that stuff taken together, not strictly the hands-on experience of flying an airplane, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of where that all came from. And then eventually I began taking flying lessons when I was, 14 years old probably. And it was a slow process because I was very young and it was expensive, and my family was financing this. Nobody was sure how it was all going to work out. And I didn't really get seriously into flight training until I was 19 or 20. And that's when I began flying and learning more or less full time, building up my hours and ratings. And then I was a flight instructor for a while. And then eventually in 1990, when I was, 23, I landed my first, pardon the pun, airline job, flying a little 15-seater turboprop, a little unpressurized piece of junk called a Beech 99, which some of your readers might know and roll their eyes at the sound of. That was my first job in the airline business as a co-pilot on this old rattletrap, making about $800 a month.
Okay, so before we run away with that and into your journey, let's just go back to your beginning. So, you mentioned, I love the way you eloquently say you were an airline geek. So with your geek qualifications, mesmerized by the whole theatre of aviation, what were your peers interested in at that time? Were you by yourself? Did you have others, or, was this a solitary thing that you did?
That's a great question. There was a group of us, 4 or 5 of us, who were kind of into this thing all together. We would go to the airport together. We would, trade books, and we were all into planes. And of that group, I'm the only one who kind of kept going with it and actually wound up working in the industry. I still know a couple of those people, and, they still have this, little bit of an infatuation with airplanes, and we can talk about planes and flying, but they're not in the business. I was the only one who followed through on that, and that's for different reasons. Some of them economical, financial. It's just the way it worked out.
Fabulous. I love that. Like with everything, it's all about levels, and, even in geekism, I don't know if that's a real word, but yeah, geekism.
Geekism. Well, if it's not a word, let's coin it.
Yeah, let's go for it. So you took your geekism to a different level to your peers. But so what happened at 14 then? Was it just a natural progression from your love? And then how did you convince your parents to give you that first lesson and so forth?
I think it was just a logical progression, just the next step in this passion that I'd had since I was a young kid. I think it's unusual maybe for people to have something that they're that into when they're that young for so long. I think there comes a point where your parents figure out, hey, this isn't just a fad. It's not just something that's going to come and go. Let's try to work with this and make something real and lasting out of it. In this case, a career. I think if you went back to 7th grade when I was hanging out with my airplane buddies, if you'd asked each of us, what do you want to do when you grow up? We all would have said we wanted to be pilots. For whatever reason, I'm the only one that followed through on that and actually became a pilot. But I think a lot of that was, economic and just, I was very fortunate in that my family was able to fund my flight training as well as my education. And both of those things separately are very expensive.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky in that regard. My friends just, maybe didn't have that opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. It's, and fair play to you as well. It's all about having opportunity, but you've definitely got to grasp the opportunities as well and run with it. And obviously you've done that. So kudos to you.
Another thing, Marvin, I think people don't often realize is how much luck has to do with progressing in this business. Getting a job, getting with the right airlines at the right time, and so forth. It's not necessarily a matter of how good you are, how talented you are as a pilot, or how dedicated you are. It's the whims of the industry. The airline business is very cyclical, and there's so much competition for jobs. Sometimes, although that's changing, but we could maybe get to that later. But when I was coming up, that certainly was the case, and a lot of it, was just luck.
Okay, so you started flying lessons when you were 14. You said that you got your license age 19 to 20. So, when you were going through that process, you were at school in education. Did you still have your eyes firmly set on that goal, being a professional pilot?
I did, but that was a long time ago, and I was young, and I really didn't have a good sense of how that was all going to unfold. Yeah. I was working on getting my basic licenses and ratings, and the idea of sitting in a jetliner cockpit seemed still at that point to be a far off fantasy, and how I was going to get to that point, I wasn't sure. I would just do what I needed to do as far as building up experience and getting my licenses and ratings and see how it played out. And, it was a step-by-step process, and there was some adversity along the way. Airlines going out of business. I was laid off for 5.5 years at one point. I had another airline I worked for went out of business completely. And, it's interesting when you talk to pilots, a resume like mine isn't at all uncommon. I know one guy who recently just retired who had worked for something like 11 different carriers over his career. Yeah. And other people get on at exactly the right time in the hiring cycle, and they work for one airline their entire careers without a hiccup. That's unusual, but it does happen. And of course, my past is the way it is, partly because I came up through the ranks as a civilian. Other pilots go into the military and progress that way, which is a little bit different.
Okay, so let's just touch on that a little bit. So you obviously got your PPL. So take us through the journey that you went on with your ratings from your PPL through to your frozen ATPL license. And you referenced there as a civilian. I guess in hindsight, can you see any difference between a civilian going through that training and of that of your peers that were in the military?
Well, and let's keep in mind when we do this that I'm talking about how the process works here in the U.S. It can be quite different overseas. Here, it's very do-it-yourself, building up hours, building up ratings, one at a time at your own expense. PPL, commercial license, instrument rating, and then flight instructor certificate. And my first paying job as a pilot was as an instructor. And that's very common here in the U.S. because when you have 300 or so hours, there aren't a lot of other ways to build flight time and experience from that point without just buying it. So I instructed for, I don't know what it was, 3-4 years. I have, I think, 1,100 hours in my logbook of instruction given, which is 1,100 hours of my life I'm never going to get back.
Never.
Don't want to go back there. And then finally was able to get the job that I mentioned a few minutes ago, flying the little turboprop. At that point, I had about 1,600 total hours and a brand new airline transport pilot license in my possession. And back in those days, those were typical qualifications to land a shitty job with a shitty little carrier. There were maybe 10 people in my class, my new hire class, and there were guys with 2,000, 3,000 hours who had flown jets, even a couple of guys who'd been in the military. It's very different now where you can progress to the airline level with fewer hours and ratings overall, although that's changing as well.
Okay. So before we jump into your first role in the Beech 99, which you described so eloquently, let's just jump back to just some challenges that you experienced during your flight training, and in particular your PPL. So you obviously said it was a while ago now. So let's go back. If you can remember back, what was one of the main challenges, number one challenge that you had when you were learning to fly? And this is for the benefit of someone sitting on the fence or currently having their own challenges.
I'm laughing because what I wish is I could track down my old instructors and apologize to them for being such a crappy student. I was just such a slacker.
Really?
Yeah. I wasn't bad. I was just lazy. And I regret that. The same way I regret, not having done better in high school and college. All the things your parents say eventually do turn out to be true.
Fabulous. Well, I admire your blatant honesty there. But yeah, you're here now, and that's the most important thing. So excellent. Okay. So, you mentioned the Beech 99, and obviously we've mentioned the 767 and 757. So before we run away, literally, can you just give us a sort of rundown of all your aircraft types that you've flown to date, and give us the one that rises to the top there and is your favorite?
Good question. Well, going back to general aviation, mostly, your grab bag of Pipers and Cessnas. I was always more of a Piper fan than a Cessna fan. Yeah. Back in those days, there were really only the two as far as training went, occasional Beechcraft thrown in. Now you've got Cirrus and all these other light planes that are much more sophisticated than what I had to work with. The Beech 99, which I described, a long-lost turboprop called the Metroliner. I have about 1,000 hours in that thing. Yeah. The Dash 8, another turboprop called the British Aerospace Jetstream 41. Good luck finding one of those still flying. I was a flight engineer, a second officer on the DC-8 for a while. Wow. That was kind of exciting at first, but the novelty wore off. It was the biggest thing I'd ever flown, and suddenly I was going to Europe, and this was with a cargo carrier. So that was all very exciting at first, but then it kind of dawned on me, this plane is 40 something years old, and it just
it's getting on a bit, isn't it?
Yeah, the novelty wore off. I wanted to fly something newer, something more exciting, more modern. 737. And then the 757 and 767, which I fly now. Now, it's tempting to say that the 767 is my favorite plane because it's the biggest thing I've ever flown, and I've flown it all around the world. But you know what? When I go back, sentimentally at least, I have to single out the little old Dash 8,
Yeah.
the high wing twin turboprop, because back in those days, at that first commuter carrier that I worked at, I was 25, I think. And that was the first, I guess, for lack of a better term, real airplane that I'd flown. I mean, it had a flight attendant.
Whoa.
And
that's it, right? That's it.
and an autopilot, like a real sophisticated autopilot. I'd never experienced any of that. I'd flown that Beech 99 and the Metroliner, and those were old school, just raw data, no autopilot, just very hands-on flying, no flight attendant. You had to do the passenger briefing. You had to escort the people up and down the aisle, sometimes loading the bags. And then I made this leap to what really felt like airline flying.
Yeah.
And in my mind back then, the Dash 8 was it was a 37-seater, but to me, it might as well have been a 747. It was just this gigantic plane. And I couldn't believe that I was sitting in the left seat of that thing.
Wow. Yeah.
It was really cool. And for those reasons, that I kind of go back to that as, a real high point of my career, just because it was the first time.
Fabulous. Okay. I love the Dash 8. I love the shape, and they're sort of all slender and a bit sort of awkward looking, but definitely.
It's definitely not the most graceful looking plane. And by the way, listeners should know that all of this is explained in, I think, more eloquent detail in my book, I think in chapters 1 and 2, where I kind of talk through my career. And there are some funny parts in there where I describe, especially where I describe the Metroliner. Another sentimental moment, and I talk about this in the book, that the first trip I took in that crappy little Beech 99, that was as ridiculous as the plane itself was. My first flight in that plane, that was my first takeoff as an airline pilot. So that, too, is something that I remember quite fondly and put near the top of all my experiences.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the first flight that I made was into Boston, into Logan Airport in Boston, which is the airport where I had hung out at for, weekend after weekend throughout my whole childhood, even into high school. So to be piloting a plane as a paid airline pilot, crappy as the plane was, and touching down at Logan on that afternoon.
Yeah.
And let's see if I can remember the date. It was October, I want to say 21st, 1990. That was special, to be looking at the airport from the cockpit instead of being in the observation deck looking out at the planes, to have finally made it. That was a big moment for me.
Yeah, that sounds great. And done a little Google there of the Beechcraft 99. I think you were going a bit too tough on this little aircraft. She looks all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this was 1990, and
Yeah.
even then it was considered pretty much obsolete. And all of our competitor carriers had, Saabs and Dash 8s and ATRs. And back in those days, that was kind of this was pre-regional jet. Regional jets didn't really exist yet. So you aspired to fly a Saab or a Dash 8.
Yeah.
Amazing how different it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you said you did some flight instructing, and then obviously you were hour building. So tell us what the process, albeit you weren't that happy about it in hindsight, getting that first airline job, so what was the process? CV out there, just tell us that story, just to help others or inspire others who are maybe, looking to get that first job.
Well, everybody needed the ATP certificate, the Airline Transport Pilot certificate, as it's called here in the U.S., before you really became competitive for a job at a regional. This is late 80s, early 90s. And so really nothing could happen until you had that. And so as soon as I had the 1,500 hours requisite for that, and had done my studying and had taken the written test, I took a commercial flight down to Texas and did kind of a 3-day crash course, so to speak, and got the ATP license, and then began sending out just swarms of resumes and applications to pretty much every regional carrier that existed. And that process would kind of repeat itself later on after I'd worked in the regionals for long enough, better part of 8 years, and then had spent 4 years flying cargo as a flight engineer, applying to the major carriers. Just resume after resume, application after application. And, when you're in that situation where you end up is often a case just who's the first airline to call back.
Simple as that, yeah?
Yeah. And back in 1990, this local company, it was one of the commuter affiliates of Northwest Airlines, called me up, and they were based right here in New Hampshire. And, they called me in for an interview, which took place in kind of the dusty back room of a hangar. They offered me the job, and I could be based right at home. I wasn't going to make a lot of money, that's for sure, but that was going to be the case no matter what. So I took the job, and I was there for 4 years until they went out of business.
Fabulous. So you did 4 years there. I think you said you did about 8 years in the regionals. So what was the case? They went out of business. You were a jobless pilot.
Yeah, working in the regionals in those days was tough. It was a difficult environment. You worked hard. You worked long hours. There was often a hostile environment when it came to the pilots versus management. It was never a comfortable place to be. So you didn't want to stay there for any longer than you had to. So once you had enough hours to be competitive at the next level, you started sending out those resumes. And from there, I jumped to flying freight for the cargo company DHL as an engineer, second officer on the DC-8.
Fabulous. Okay, so I've heard the phrase "freight dog." So is that something you're familiar with, or is that just the movies?
Oh yeah, flying the DC-8, we had a little more civilized, more dignified lifestyle than guys flying the smaller planes on short hauls, because we did a lot of European flying, long haul or longish haul across the North Atlantic. So the pace was a little slower. We did a lot of daytime flying, so we weren't that strict, dirty, grimy, backside of the clock flying, even though it was cargo.
Yeah, I've always been curious about the differences between cargo pilots and passenger airline pilots. Based on your own experience, what's the difference in terms of prep? Is it exactly the same? It's like you're just not talking to the cabin crew, or what key differences are there?
Yeah, it's very different in a lot of ways, and it's very similar in a lot of ways. Cargo versus passenger. Having done both, generally flying passengers is a more gentlemanly, more civilized environment, but not necessarily. A lot of it just depends which carrier you're talking about. Flying cargo for FedEx or UPS, there's not a whole lot of difference between doing that and flying for one of the big passenger carriers.
Yeah. In terms of standard operating procedures, bank angles, does that all change because you haven't got any passengers on, or? No,
not really. No. SOP is pretty similar across the board.
Fabulous. Okay, so 4 years in cargo. So what was the next step in your journey from being a freight dog?
Scoring a job with a major commercial carrier. And that was the ultimate goal all along. And finally it happened. I was never really sure one way or the other that it would happen. And, that's the thing. You never assume that you're going to make it to that level of 100 pilots who start out. How many actually make it to the major carriers? It's a tiny fraction. It takes persistence, dedication. You have to be good at the job, and luck, again, is a big part of it too. And, I got lucky at different spots along the way, and I made it, and I'm glad I did. And here I am, which when I think back to when I was a kid, at the observation deck at Logan, to have actually made it to this level, still is hard to believe sometimes. It's something I try to never take for granted, even when the job gets stressful and, becomes a pain in the ass, like it often does, like any job. But I have to always keep that bigger perspective and make sure that I remember how I got there and that I did. You
mentioned earlier, you did the 737, 757, 767. So is it literally a case of you just within your carrier, you're flying the aircraft available within that carrier? Is there a next step for you possibly, or command position?
There's always a next step. And this is something I get into in the book. Which airplane you fly, which city you fly out of. A lot of that is what your seniority allows you to hold. The 757, 767 in much of the world is an obsolete airplane. I'm aware of that. It's old 70s technology. I wish I could fly something bigger and shinier and newer to cooler places. But at my company, my seniority just doesn't allow that. And that's fine. I'm at a major carrier, making a good living, flying a great schedule, in a relatively cool plane to cool places. I can't be greedy.
Yeah.
I'm not at Emirates flying an A380. But there are aspects of the job that I can enjoy here that I wouldn't enjoy there. And well, that gets into a different conversation. But the long and short of this is that I'm happy where I am. But what a pilot flies, where and when, it can vary so much with seniority and, of course, what your particular airline has to offer. If you're flying for Southwest Airlines here in the U.S. or, say, Ryanair in Europe, EasyJet, you're flying a narrow body short haul aircraft because that's all there is. There are different opportunities at different airlines. And here, when you make it to the major carrier level, with very limited number of exceptions, the airline you get on with is the one you stay with, because once you accrue any sort of seniority, giving that up is very difficult to do. As most people realize, there's no sideways transfer of seniority or qualifications from one carrier to another. When you move from airline A to airline B, you drop to the bottom and you start all over again as far as pay and benefits and the bidding that your seniority allows. So you get with a company and you stay there. That's generally how it works here. It's funny, I get emails sometimes from young pilots, aspiring pilots, wannabe pilots, say, I really want to work for United Airlines. It's like, well, you can't do that. You can't pick which major carrier you want to go to work for. You have to be pretty lucky to be able to do that. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, like you mentioned earlier, a bit of luck, and as you referenced, sometimes it's just the first person that returns your call or answers your job application. So that's a bit of timing, luck, and whatever else you believe in. So yeah, interesting. That seniority system always does sort of amaze me, because it's like a guaranteed system to lock people into one particular airline. You do obviously hear people sort of moving airlines most of the time, or sometimes it can be from, like you mentioned earlier, airlines folding and collapsing. So it's sort of a bit of a push, as it were, rather than a jump. Yeah,
there's definitely a good and bad about the seniority system and how it works here. There are times occasionally when pilots will move from one carrier to another, but generally that happens when the pilot is very junior and hasn't accrued enough seniority for that to be a real sacrifice. But once you've built up some tenure, doing that becomes extremely difficult.
Okay, so you're on the 767 now. Are you type rated on both aircraft, or are you just on the 767? Can you have both?
You can. The 757, 767 is one of the rare cases where type rating allows you to fly both aircraft. Sometimes on the same day.
Fabulous. Okay. So what's a typical flying day for you now, sectors-wise, locations?
I love that question, typical flying day, as if there's such a thing.
That was in quotes.
It can vary so much. I mean, the schedules we work, and this is discussed in the book in chapter 4, I think it is, can range from single day trips where you fly to a city and then back again to 8 or 10 day trips where you're halfway around the world. I fly a mix of domestic U.S. and transatlantic operations, a little bit South America, West Africa. So it's a mix. I like that. I like throwing in domestic rotations now and then to mix things up a little bit. There are pros and cons to short haul and long haul that I think doing a little of each is, for me anyway, ideal.
Yeah. You sort of mentioned earlier about different stresses, and obviously every job has its own stresses and politics and all this stuff. But, just to get a sense of the kind of stresses or potential stresses that an airline pilot could have, can you sort of elaborate on that?
Well, there's two ways to answer that. Stresses that are particular to the job itself, training, medical certification, being at the mercy of the cycles of the industry, how close am I to getting laid off when things start to go bad, things like that. But above and beyond that, the things that stress pilots out are the things that stress most passengers out. It's, delays, hassles at security, and so forth. It's something that you're familiar with too anytime you fly.
But everyone has their issues, and I like the way you say that, the pilots have the same sort of challenges and stresses as even the passengers. So it's all good. Okay, so I mentioned in the bio there you are the host of 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗰𝗆.com, and that's what basically caught my attention, and got a very established website with lots of information. And give us a sort of bit of a history of how that sort of came about.
Going back as long as I can remember, I always had kind of a latent interest in writing. And later on, I came to self-publish these goofy little punk rock fanzines, and I did music reviews and occasional travel reviews for little magazines and stuff. And it wasn't until after September 11th, when I'd lost my job, that I decided to take that more seriously and try to create at least kind of a part-time job out of it. And it worked. I started writing essays, rants, you could call a lot of them, for an online magazine called Salon, about the airline business, airport security, airline culture, things that I knew and could write about. That started off slowly, one little piece at a time, and I would get a little check for each one, and it was really exciting actually getting paid to write something. I didn't ever really expect that to happen. And then it built from there. I began publishing a regular weekly column, and then that became a book. And then eventually the gig I had with that online magazine went away because it had run for 10 years and it was just finished. And so I took the Ask the Pilot, which is what it was called, that brand independent, so to speak, on my own website, which is what you see now if you go to askthepilot.com. And a second book grew out of that. And it's something I do, I guess you'd say, as a hobby. It's certainly not full time. I just don't have the time and resources to devote to it for it to be, bigger and better than it is. But it's a lot of fun, and it's something I feel that I have to do. It's an outlet for this, kind of secondary passion that I've had my whole life.
Yeah, fabulous. I think, like you said, you've mentioned before, the fluctuations of the industry, the ups and downs. You previously didn't know when, you got laid off once, and you don't know when on the downturn, how close you are to being laid off. And it's always good to have, not all your eggs in one basket, and it's something else, even if it's not, like you say, it's a part-time thing, and monetary wise, it may not be significant compared to your main thing. But like you say, it's good to have an outlet and to be creative. And to be honest, I've looked through many of the articles now, and you're pretty good at it. And I like it seems very, sort of mature. You seem to be a mature writer, not necessarily in like age-wise, but in terms of the quality of the writing. It looks like like a journalist quality writing, not just part-time anybody putting pen to paper or typing the key. So kudos to you. It's great. And in terms of the content, what's driving you in terms of content? You seem to be quite, got a lot of questions and answers thing going on. Plus you're sort of touching on some topical things, like the latest thing you can see here, the Qatar Auckland route. So you're touching on some new things. I had some amusement reading your comments on the Sully movie, but I'll let the listeners check that out there. Yeah, what drives your content? Is it literally just what's on your mind? And more importantly, what kind of feedback have you had from readers?
Well, first, Marvin, thanks for the compliment. I would never call myself a journalist, but I do take it seriously, and I try to be good at it. I put a lot of work into even kind of the shorter posts that I put up. And, I've always had this creative side, and this is how it manifests itself. It's something I really enjoy doing. And what I write about really is kind of anything and everything to do with commercial air travel, from security to airports to one of my favorite topics, critiques of airline paint jobs and liveries and logos. You name it, I kind of go all over the place. And now that the Ask the Pilot site is mine, and I'm not writing for another publication, it's not part of another publication, I have total freedom to write about whatever I want. And sometimes I'll veer off into politics or music, or post some rant about this or that cultural phenomenon in a way that I think is well done, not just off the cuff and spontaneous. It's maybe a little more thoughtful than that. I try to be, what's the right word? I don't want my stuff to read as amateurish. I want people to take it seriously, and so I try hard. And there's humor blended in with it. If I have a target audience, who are they? It's not people who are into planes, strictly speaking. It's not people who have a vested interest in the business or are predisposed to airplanes. It's kind of everybody who travels, everybody who flies, including people who hate the experience. A lot of my readers are nervous flyers. A lot are just frequent flyers, and a lot are just people curious about a strange and very misunderstood business. And so I draw from all different demographics. Large percentage of my readership is women. And I have readers all over the world, the UK, Australia. I've gotten letters from Bhutan, you name it. And going back to what I touched on earlier about the grand theater of air travel, that's kind of what the site is. It's just taking in all the different aspects of commercial flying, from the technological to the cultural.
Yeah, I like what you say there, the theatre of flying and aviation. And yeah, sometimes, people fly to different countries all the time. The world's definitely smaller with aviation, but it still is a mystery. We turn up at the airport, we get processed by the system, we jump on an airplane, the door shuts, don't normally see the pilots if we do, if we're lucky, but then we pop out the other end. But there is a lot of magic, that sort of fluff and fairy dust and unicorn horns that happen in between then, and I think having people like yourself who are in the industry, who are willing, because it's all right being in the industry having an opinion, but being in the industry having an opinion and writing about it is another. So you're definitely not amateurish. It definitely is very professional in my eyes. And I like the way that you have been picked up by some other media outlets. Sounds like you've been pretty busy in terms of sort of representing or being the voice of aviation for a number of reasons. How did you get involved with touching on other media outlets?
Yeah, I do occasional commentary for cable TV, network television. I've been in a few documentaries. Newspapers call me, radio stations call me when there are incidents and accidents, and anytime this or that air travel related story is in the news, and that's really fun to do. Let's face it, air travel flying, commercial flying, is something that almost everybody does nowadays, but few people really have an understanding of how it all works. And meanwhile, there's so much just bad information out there, so many urban myths and misunderstandings about almost everything. And the frustration over that, reading inaccurate news stories, watching people on TV, spout nonsense about, something that happened in a crash. That frustration is part of what inspired me to do what I do back when I started writing after 9/11. There's not a lot of places for people to turn for good information. And the airlines themselves are very recalcitrant, very secretive. And one result of that is there's a lot of mistrust. People don't like the experience. They don't trust airlines, and so they buy into a lot of this bad information, a lot of these urban myths that are out there, because that's all there is, that's all they know. So I that's part of my mission, is to explain the truth to people, and not in a way that's scandalous. That's not what I do. I'm not whistleblowing. I'm not being sensational. I'm not trying to expose the dirty secrets of the airlines. On the contrary, most of what I do is very pro flying, which is quite different. There's just not a lot of that out there, because so many people hate flying and hate the airlines. You don't often hear it from another direction. I try to remind people that flying is incredibly inexpensive nowadays compared to how it used to be. It's extraordinarily safe, and I try to encourage people to maybe learn to reappreciate the experience when they go into it in a way that's just, I know that's a tough mission. Yeah. With all of the incivilities and indignities of flying nowadays. But, really, it's, when you really look at it, quite an amazing experience, even today. And I try to remind people of that.
Okay, fabulous. I think having, like you said, being pro-flying and you're in the industry as well. So that's good to hear, right? I appreciate that from a passenger's point of view.
It's funny, my book, the title of the book is Cockpit Confidential, which when you hear it, it sounds scary and scandalous, but it's not that kind of a book at all. And there was some back and forth between the publisher and me over the title. But I don't know, maybe that works to my advantage. People pick up the book thinking it's going to be this sensationalist tell-all, and they're going to learn all these dirty secrets, and they don't. But you do learn a lot of good, useful, and surprising information. And I think I think also the book is funny, and you can read segments of it, excerpts on the website. A lot of the book's actually drawn from the website. So if you're curious, click over.
Okay, so your book, Cockpit Confidential, everything you need to know about air travel. So how did this come about, and how long has it been out now?
The book came out in 2013. There was an earlier book. It was called Ask the Pilot, which was a horrible name that they forced on me. Yeah. Of course, that's the name of my website, which I never liked it, but that was it was assigned to me back when I was writing for the magazine Salon, and it became such a fixture that I couldn't change it at that point.
It was a great domain.
The first book was, I guess you could call it an abbreviated, maybe dumbed down version of the Cockpit Confidential book that came out later on. Not nearly as good. Luckily, it's out of print. The second book, Cockpit Confidential, is really the book that I wanted to write all along, and went with a second publisher and basically redid the entire project, new packaging, new title, lots of new material. It's a much better book that I can be proud of, and it came out in 2013, and I'm currently working on edits and revisions for a second edition. When that would be out, I'm not sure.
Okay, cool. So I'll make sure the Cockpit Confidential, everything you need to know about air travel, is linked to on your show notes, and also 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗰𝗆.com. Okay, so you've mentioned what you're doing now in terms of your 767, 757 flying, but what's the future for Patrick?
That's a really good question. I guess I want to progress as much as I can professionally with the carrier that I'm at now, as far as when seniority and practicality allow it, moving up to bigger, newer planes, flying to new places, and working on the website and writing. I don't really foresee a lot of change, but I don't want that. So it's really stay the course and keep doing what I'm doing. That sounds really boring, doesn't it? But it's true. I love my job. I love the writing that I do. I love traveling in my spare time, and there's no reason I just can't keep doing those things.
Totally concur there. So, if you're happy, you've got a great job that you enjoy, you've got a moonlighting job that you enjoy as well, and it's all great. So why stop? And I commend you. A lot of people are out there doing stuff which they don't really, not passionate about, they don't really like, but they're just doing it. So if you can mix professional happiness with personal happiness, then why stop? So yeah, totally agree with you there.
Well, you said it better than I could, and that's something I'm well aware of. How many people out there just aren't where they want to be, hate their jobs. That's the case for millions of people out there. So I do consider myself very fortunate, and that's never lost on me. And
let's go back to flying now. So Patrick, what is your proudest moment in your flying career so far? Tell us that story.
I think my proudest moment has to go back to 1990 when I made that very first flight on the little old Beech 99 as an airline pilot for the very first time. Nothing particularly dramatic about it. The stock answer there is usually, my first takeoff in a 747 or, but I guess I come at it from a little bit of a more sentimental angle. Yeah. I spent all those years at the airport watching planes take off and land, and here I was finally, as a pilot, touching down at that same airport in my first day on the job. It was really exciting and also kind of funny. There's a segment in the book where I talk about this, but that morning, in my excitement and with all the adrenaline, I managed to lose my tie.
Not the tie.
I had to go to the mall at 10 in the morning and buy a tie. And then the look on the clerk's face when he says, what kind of tie do you need? And I say, plain black polyester. Like they would even have such a thing. And then getting onto the plane, I cut my hand on a screw that was sticking out from the door. The 99 had this manually operated door that you would pull up with a strap and then kind of rotate to lock. And as I rotated, I cut my knuckles on a screw. So I walk up to the cockpit in this ridiculous tie that I had just bought that was totally wrong and didn't match. And meanwhile, my hand is bleeding. And it was just a hilarious scene. And I was late because they hadn't told me which part of the airport I was supposed to go to get a ride out to the apron. And so the captain's looking at me like, "Where the hell have you been?" And there I am in my mismatched uniform and blood dripping down my arm.
Fabulous.
Had to be there.
Yeah, I've got visions of you turning up for work. You've literally looks like a scene out of a horror movie. You've got a Snoopy tie on, and you're late. So yeah, at your service. Awesome, love it. Okay, Patrick, this is my favorite part of the show now. Welcome to the Quick Fire Checklist. This is where I ask you a series of questions and you come back to us, the inspired pilots, with amazing and inspiring answers. How does that sound? You ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
What is the best piece of advice related to flying that you've ever received?
All right, here's one. Always have a pen. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but I remember a time when I was a student pilot getting my multi-engine license, and my instructor turns to me and he says, "Hey, can I use your pen? I need to sign this flight release or whatever." Yeah. And I just stared at him. And he says, "You don't have a pen, do you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "What kind of a pilot doesn't have a pen?"
Exactly.
And he was right. Little simple things like that really stay with you sometimes. And to this day, I always carry 3 things in my uniform shirt pockets. I carry a ballpoint pen, a red Sharpie marker, and a yellow highlighter. And those 3 things are indispensable for me. I just can't go if I don't have all 3 of those pieces of equipment with me.
I totally get that. Be prepared, basically. And I think I had one instance where I didn't have a pen and I'm flying and I'm going into controlled airspace and they gave me a squawk. I've got the worst memory and I literally had to memorize it and I almost died instantly at that moment. But lessons learned, I have my own flight bag checklist adhered to nowadays. So yeah, cool. Always have a pen. All right. Do you have a favorite internet flying resource that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Again, I'm an airline geek. My favorite online sites are probably seatguru.com, which is basically a site where you can surf through all the different airlines and look at the different seating schemes on their different aircraft. That sounds really dweeby, and it is. But for whatever reason, I just have this strange infatuation with seat maps, and I can just sit there surfing looking, oh, here's what Air India has on their 787, and oh, here's what Qatar has on their A380, and looking at the different cabins and the way they're arranged. And there's a weird, almost kind of Zen exercise in that. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but I know I'm not the only one, because there are actually applications that you can buy where you can make your own seat maps. So there's something to this, but anyway, I love that site. It's seatguru.com. I was a big fan of the airliners.net site until they revised the site. They gave it a complete makeover a couple of months ago, and I think it looks just terrible, and it's very difficult to navigate, so I haven't been stopping by there as much as I used to. There's FlightAware, and of course there's askthepilot.com, which is far and away the most compelling of all the online sources, he said modestly.
The most compelling online resource. Excellent. Just going back to that seatguru.com. Obviously, if you like rearranging the insides of aircraft and that geekism as we referred to earlier, but does that have like a purpose in terms of, like, I've heard of sites where people can choose what's the safest place to sit on an aircraft?
I guess the commercial purpose of Seat Guru is for passengers who have a flight coming up to look at the seat map and figure out where the best and worst places to sit are. I'll look at the seat map and just imagine that I'm flying first class on Singapore Airlines and pick out which seat theoretically I'd love to sit in, maybe someday. Again, though, it's just, even if I don't have a flight coming up on one of these planes, there's just something about those maps. And I don't know. Again, I said it was kind of a Zen attraction. I don't know. I can't explain it. It's just cool.
Excellent. Okay, I like that. Seatguru.com. Okay, the next question is kind of just as polarizing as Pipers versus Cessnas, but trikes or tail draggers?
I've never flown a tail dragger, or a plane on floats for that matter. I have this fantasy, though, when I win $100 million in the lottery, what I want to do is get a Dash 8 and put floats on it and fly it around Africa. Like, start at the top and just do a circumnavigation of the whole continent, landing on little lakes and rivers. And wouldn't that be cool?
Wow. I'm pretty good at Photoshop. I might drop that in there and see what it comes out with. Okay.
I have no idea if you could actually put floats on a Dash 8, but it's a fun idea.
Okay, let me see for your show notes page, see what I can do. As well as Cockpit Confidential, can you recommend one aviation-related book?
One of my favorite books is a title called Airline, Identity, Design and Culture by a British author named 𝗜ጵ26. And this is an airline book. It's not an airplane book. It's not about flying per se. It's about airline identity, airline liveries, airline culture, that sort of thing, which I've always been really into. And I think Lovegrove's book is maybe the best out there on that topic.
Okay, so Airline by 𝗜ጵ26, and I'll make sure that's linked to in your show notes. It definitely goes back to what you referred to in the beginning of the interview about the theatre of aviation. So yeah, I'll check that out. What is your favorite non-essential but essential to you technology gadget in your cockpit?
How about a sunshade? Now, you'd think a modern aircraft that costs hundreds of millions of dollars would have something as simple as a pull-across sunshade to keep the sun from scorching you when you're at 35,000 feet flying across the ocean. But most of them, in fact, don't. But when they're there, it's great. I relish the sunshade, and I wish every airplane had one. It's always something low-tech, I think. I'd also say a small bottle of hand sanitizer and some wet naps. I think people would be surprised just how dirty cockpits are. I mean, they're covered in dust and food particles and all kinds of crap. And I'm a little bit compulsive with that sort of thing. So I'll take out my wet naps and kind of clean down the cockpit.
Wow.
From time to time.
Okay, that's interesting because I totally get that. Okay, now here's my favorite question now. If you had a time machine and could go back in time and meet your younger self, Patrick, just as you were about to start your flying journey, knowing what you know now, 767, 757 pilot, what advice would you give yourself?
Ooh, the dreaded time machine question.
That's the one.
Yeah, I don't know if this is fair. It's so easy to go back and self-critique, and you always see things so much more clearly in retrospect. But let's see, if I could go back, I'd probably grab myself and shake myself by the shoulders and say, hey, take this a little more seriously, be a little bit more dedicated, work a little harder and faster at it. Because when you're aspiring to become an airline pilot, the faster you move through the process and the sooner you get a position at a good carrier, the more money you're going to make, the better your quality of life is going to be later on, because you're going to be gaining tenure and seniority quicker. I was complacent at some of the jobs I had, hey, this isn't so bad, the money's kind of okay, and I was lazy. I didn't try to move. I didn't try to progress quicker. I didn't finish my college degree until much later on. And at one point, I had all these awesome flight credentials, but I didn't have the degree that the airlines were all requiring for applicants. And so I had to go and finish that later on separately. Yeah. Which really set me back, probably a matter of at least a couple of years. And kind of corollary to that, it's interesting. I get a lot of emails from people saying, hey, I want to become a pilot. I'm going to be flight training. Meanwhile, what do I do about college? What should I be studying? Should I study physics? Should I study math? And I usually say to these people, no. In fact, concentrate on something that's not related to aviation.
Yeah.
I have colleagues at the airlines who studied music, economics, English, you name it. And I think that works to your advantage two ways. It rounds you better as a person, and I think airlines appreciate that when they're interviewing you. Also, though, it gives you something to fall back on should the aviation thing not pan out. And for a lot of people, it doesn't pan out. So pick something that you're passionate about, that you're interested in, separate from aviation as a backup in case the career in flying doesn't progress the way you want it to.
Wow, yeah, absolutely great. I totally agree with you there. A couple of our other guests talked about enthusiasm and the perception that people have of you as a professional pilot can basically take you a long way. So you mentioned that there, as in take this more seriously, Guy. And then the second point in terms of, not having all your eggs in one basket and having that second chance or that alternate sort of moonlighting job, as I sort of referred to earlier, as you referred to earlier, and and being a more rounded person. And I can imagine basically being on the long haul and sitting next to someone who doesn't have a lot to say could be a bit of a chore as well. So yeah, totally get that. Patrick, listening to your journey and the stories you've shared have been very inspiring to me. And I like the way that you literally started off at the grassroots of the airline industry. and you sort of followed a steady evolution of the jobs from that lovely Beechcraft 99, Metroliner, DC-8, all the way through to the 767, 757 where you are now. So I think that gives you a very useful viewpoint of the industry as a whole, which is good stuff. Can you give the audience of Inspired Pilots one last piece of guidance and share how people can get in contact with you, and then we'll sign off?
Okay, let's see. One last piece of guidance, piece of advice. I don't want this to sound too negative. I don't want this to be a downer, but if you're a young pilot, an aspiring pilot, and you think you want to become an airline pilot, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is to know what you're getting into. And by that, I mean recognize the pitfalls that could lie ahead. The airline industry is very cyclical. It's not unusual to have pretty traumatic setbacks along the way. Airlines going out of business, being made redundant, laid off, as we call it here. And so on and so forth. You're not going to make a lot of money in the beginning. And keep in mind, too, that the regional airline sector, the smaller planes flying short-haul routes, has grown so big that for a lot of pilots now, that's as far as you can expect to progress. Very few pilots make it to the major carrier level. So looking at all of those things, weighing all those things, if you think you're okay with that and still want to give it a try and still feel passionate about it, then you've got the bug, so to speak, and go for it and don't be talked out of it. But if you look at this stuff, if you look at these possibilities and get squeamish and say, hey, I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I can handle that. I don't know if I want it that bad, then maybe you should look at a different career.
You mentioned a word there, passion, being passionate about what you're doing. And I think that carries you a long way, and if you don't have the passion, then maybe, you should seek alternatives, because when the tough gets going and things get a little bit rough, sometimes you need a bit more than willpower to take you through. So great piece of advice there. Thanks for that.
Exactly.
Okay. And how can people get in contact with you?
People can reach me through my website. It's askthepilot.com. And you can see an email link right there on the page. And I try to answer all of my mail. So if you have a question, comment, request, send it along. I might not get back to you right away, but I will get back to you.
Fabulous. Okay, that's good stuff. I'll make sure that's linked too. Okay, Patrick, thank you for joining us on the show today, for your time. You've been very generous. On behalf of the Inspired Pilots, I'd like to say thank you and speak to you again.
Thank you, Marvin. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining me today for episode 26 of the Inspired Pilot Podcast. It was great talking with Patrick today, and listening to his story further compounds what I've learned listening to the stories of our guests on the show. And that is that every story is different, and the viewpoints and the experiences gained along the way by our inspiring pilots is all different as well. I liked how Patrick, the self-professed av-geek, was able to turn his childhood obsession into loving all things aviation, looking in from the outside, into something that he does on a daily basis, and being within the aviation industry, and some would say at the pinnacle of that, becoming a professional pilot. Nowadays, Patrick is still an avid av-geek, but this time he's sitting on the inside looking outwards, which is a great position to be in. With this vantage point, given a greater level of insight into the industry, and be able to make comment and provide his valuable input in a way that helps aviation travellers and av-geeks alike. Patrick also touched on the old saying of don't have all your eggs in one basket, and is actively following another passion of his, writing simultaneously side by side with his day job. But in this case, his moonlighting complements his day job and is a vessel to challenge his own interests in aviation, and at the same time promoting aviation and helping others gain a better understanding of the industry, which is a good thing, right? Okay, you can find the show notes for Patrick's episode, which includes all the links mentioned, by heading over to the show's website, inspiredpilot.com. And don't forget, you can also leave a comment for Patrick directly on the page and find other recommended aviation resources, so definitely go check out inspiredpilot.com. I really appreciate receiving feedback about the show, so do get in touch. I reply to every single email, and you can find me on Facebook and Twitter, and soon we'll be checking out Instagram and Pinterest. If you do like the show, I'd be really grateful if you share inspiredpilot.com with one colleague or one friend or one av-geek that you feel that they would appreciate by listening to the stories of our guests. Okay, so that's your mission. Let me know how you get on. Okay, that's it for now, and don't forget, wherever you are on your pilot journey, get ready to be inspired.